What's surprising about the cold steel Bushman is that it actually makes a fairly serviceable chef's knife in the kitchen. Now I say surprising only because it's not marketed as a chef's knife, and at first appearance, with the spare shaft handle, it might not be something that you immediately think of. But if you look at it in closer detail, it has many of the same features that you would find in a chef's knife. It has the wider blade with a curve in it for chopping to a cutting board, and you can cut straight to a cutting board and your fingers are still relatively elevated. It has very thin stock, and it has a relatively thin and acute edge. It's not as thin as found on an actual chef's knife, and you'd want a nice chef's knife to have a higher grind than this. This has a very low, sort of saber hollow grind. But the thin stock and the wide blade, and like I said, relatively thin and acute edge, actually makes it perform somewhat comparable. So for example, if you take a simple task, such as cutting up an onion, and you were to actually measure the force required to simply slit the onion in half with so now if you were to do that and record the force it takes to cut the onion in half with the cold steel Bushman, and then do the exact same thing with the Chicago cutlery knife, the force is actually comparable. And the reason why is that even though the Chicago cutlery knife has a thinner and much more acute edge, the actual blade stock is actually thicker, and the two sort of counterbalance each other. So when you're working with the onions, it's actually comparable with the two knives. Now the only thing that you notice is a lot different is when you're doing tip cuts like this with the Chicago cutlery. Because the blade has a very fine distal taper, the cutting ability is higher through the tip. But if you're not doing that type of cutting and just doing power sort of mincing through the main body of the blade, again, the Bushman actually is comparable. But as you can see, it doesn't have any distal taper at all, and thus the actual tip is a lot thicker. So if you try to do fine tip work, you have to use much more force to control as much less, and it's just not very nice to do cuts like this. You can hear it, you can feel the difference, and now the force is significantly greater. But when you again go back to just slicing through the main body of the blade, you're again on something again very comparable. So again, for doing delicate work in the kitchen, you'll notice a huge difference, and that's why chef's knife will have a very fine distal taper to the tip to allow you to do that precise work. But if you're just preparing vegetables, just doing straightforward cutting, then it makes a surprisingly useful chef's knife. So I mentioned that the thinner tip on this is much nicer for working, making the horizontal cuts in the onions and then making the fine tip mincing. But the stronger tip of course, the stronger tip on the Bushman is more useful when we have to do things like this. Which you wouldn't want to do with a really finely ground chef's knife. But the tip on the cold steel Bushman does that extremely trivially.